This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into, a really tough part of American history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. I mean, you probably know the basics, but we're going way deeper, way beyond that surface level, right, to get into the nuances and complexities that people don't always talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember this whole thing didn't just appear out of nowhere. Like, the seeds of this suspicion, they were there way before the war even started.
You're totally right. I mean, tensions between the U.S. and Japan, those had been building for years, especially with Japan, like expanding its power in East Asia all through the 1930s.
Exactly. Think about it. Japan's like aggressively going into Manchuria and China. That's a direct challenge to, U.S. interest in the Pacific. This isn't some small political disagreement. This is a big clash of global powers.
And it's fascinating, that U.S. intelligence, they'd already started watching Japanese Americans as early as 1935. And get this, even without any solid proof of, spying or anything. So right there, you can see that mistrust taking root.
Oh, absolutely. And then, well, we all know what came next. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
Hard to even describe the impact of that attack. It wasn't just a military hit. It was like this psychological blow that just like totally changed the mood of the whole country. Fear and outrage were everywhere.
And unfortunately, those emotions, they quickly turned into xenophobia, like all over the place, especially on the West Coast. Just think thousands of people of Japanese descent were arrested, and just based on like rumors and suspicion, nothing real.
And the media, well, they weren't exactly helping. Some California newspapers were printing these crazy headlines, saying thousands of Japanese Americans right there in San Francisco were planning sabotage. I mean, it was just, fear-mongering. But it worked. It created this atmosphere of panic, this real distrust.
Chilling example of how easily public perception can be like manipulated, especially when there's a crisis. And that paved the way for, well, one of the most controversial decisions in American history, Executive Order 9066.
This is where things get really, really complicated. You've got these, these powerful figures like Secretary of War Henry Stimson pushing for this mass evacuation of Japanese Americans from the whole West Coast. They were saying it was absolutely like essential, for national security.
But then on the other side, you have J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, and he's saying, no, mass internment, totally unnecessary. He thought they already had the dangerous people, and a wider roundup was just too much. So even within the government, there were these totally different opinions about what to do.
And stuck in the middle of all this is President Roosevelt. Can you imagine the pressure? The country's reeling from Pearl Harbor. There's this fear of a full-on invasion of the West Coast, and everyone's demanding action. So February 1942, he signs Executive Order 9066.
What really gets me about this order is how carefully they worded it. It doesn't actually say Japanese Americans, but it gives the military all this power to exclude anyone they see as a threat from these military areas. And guess what? Guess what those areas ended up being?
The entire West Coast, right, where almost all Japanese Americans lived. It's like this order gave them legal cover to force out and imprison over 120,000 people, and 2/3 of them American citizens. Think about that. They lost their freedoms, all because of their ancestry.
And it's important to remember that the government didn't just treat all Japanese Americans the same. They had these three groups they targeted. The Issei, those were first-generation immigrants. They couldn't become citizens because of these discriminatory laws. Then the Nisei, they're American-born kids. And then the Kibei, Nisei, who'd spent time in Japan for, education.
So they're using these legal distinctions to try and, justify what they're doing. But when it comes down to it, their arguments, there were two main ones, right? National security and preemptive action.
Right. On the national security front, they were playing on this very real fear of a Japanese invasion of the mainland. Their argument was basically, with so many Japanese people on the West Coast, it was better to be safe than sorry, even if there wasn't any real evidence of, spying or sabotage.
But hold on a second. Not a single case of espionage or sabotage by a Japanese American was ever proven. They were punishing an entire community based on just speculation and fear.
And that's where this military necessity idea comes in. It became this, like, trump card to just override anyone's individual rights.
And then you've got that infamous quote from General John L. DeWitt. He was the one in charge of the Western Defense Command. He basically just dismissed any nuance, saying, a Jap's a Jap. That kind of blatant racism, it was everywhere in this whole process.
Yeah, it shows you that prejudice and fear, they were a huge part of the internment. It wasn't just about strategy, it was about racial discrimination.
And this brings us to, I think, a really key moment in the legal fight against internment. The Supreme Court case, Korematsu v. United States.
1944. Fred Korematsu, a Japanese-American citizen, he challenged the whole legality of the internment orders. His case, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. This was a landmark case. It could have changed everything.
But it was a 6-3 decision. And the Supreme Court, they sided with the government, they upheld the internment orders, and they said military necessity was enough justification.
A really controversial decision. It set a dangerous precedent, basically saying that during wartime, the government can restrict your rights based on your race or origin.
So what we have here is this incredibly complex event, shaped by wartime anxiety, political pressure, and this deep, deep racial prejudice. It's a really tough part of American history to think about, but it's crucial to understand it.
Absolutely. And, what makes it even more interesting is that historians have looked at this time period from so many different angles. They offer all these different perspectives on, like, why it happened and what the consequences were.
Okay, so we've kind of set the stage here. Now let's really get into those different historical interpretations. They offer some really thought-provoking insights. So what are some of the main schools of thought that have emerged? So, we've talked about the big picture, like the politics and the laws behind Japanese internment. But now I think it's important to, like, shift gears a little and think about the human side of it. What was it actually like, to be one of those 120,000 people forced from their homes?
It's hard to imagine, right? The fear, the confusion, the feeling of betrayal. Imagine being told, okay, you've got just days to pack up your whole life, leave everything you know, and report to, well, we're not going to tell you where.
And remember, so many of these people, they were American citizens, born and raised in the U.S. They pledged allegiance to the same flag as their neighbors, and then suddenly they're treated like the enemy.
And where did they end up? These hastily built camps, often in the middle of nowhere, like think Manzanar in California or Tule Lake, Oregon. I mean, they weren't prisons exactly, but they were far from, comfortable. Crammed into these barracks, barely any privacy, limited access to even basic stuff.
Yeah, we're not talking luxury accommodations here. It's tar paper barracks, communal toilets, dust storms in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. It was a harsh reality, a far cry from the lives they'd built before the war.
And the psychological impact, huge. The humiliation of being labeled an enemy, constantly watched, no freedom, no control over your own life. It took a toll on everyone.
Definitely. And these experiences, they left lasting scars on the whole Japanese-American community. So many lost their businesses, their homes, everything they'd worked for. It wasn't just a physical hardship. It was like their dreams were shattered, their communities ripped apart, this feeling of just having their dignity stripped away.
And let's not forget, these families, they weren't all the same. You had farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, artists, all thrown together in these camps with no idea what the future held.
It's amazing, though, how they responded, right? They tried to keep some sense of normalcy. They set up schools for the kids, organized sports, even published newspapers.
It's a testament to the human spirit, don't you think? This refusal to let their circumstances define them. But we also have to acknowledge that there was resistance inside those camps, too. Not everyone just accepted their fate.
Right. Some people challenged the legality of it all. Some refused to cooperate. There were protests, hunger strikes, acts of defiance.
That internal dissent shows us that the Japanese-American experience during internment, it wasn't one single story. There were different levels of acceptance, resistance, even collaboration. It was complex, a multifaceted response to an incredibly difficult situation.
And then, as the war dragged on, the government, they started realizing, hey, we messed up. Evidence of Japanese-American loyalty started coming out, most notably, from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
The 442nd, right? A segregated unit made up almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers. Imagine that. Many of these guys, their families were still stuck in those camps.
And they fought with incredible bravery, incredible distinction in Europe. They became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history.
It's a powerful statement, about their patriotism, their willingness to risk their lives for the very country that had imprisoned them.
Their service was crucial in changing people's minds about Japanese Americans. It eventually led to, a gradual easing of those restrictions. By 1944, most of the camps were closed, but the damage was done. Those scars, they remained.
And the fight for justice, for redress, that went on long after the war ended. It was a long, long road.
Decades of activism and legal battles before the U.S. government finally admitted we were wrong.
And that brings us to 1988, when President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. It offered a formal apology and provided financial reparations to surviving internees, a huge moment, a step towards healing those old wounds.
But the legacy of Japanese internment, it's about so much more than just money, right? It forces us to ask these big questions about how fragile civil liberties really are, the dangers of prejudice and fear-mongering, and the importance of remembering history so we don't repeat it.
It's a story that resonates even today, I think, especially in a world where we see those same fears and prejudices directed at other groups now. The internment of Japanese Americans, it's a cautionary tale. It reminds us that we have to always be vigilant.
Absolutely. We can't afford to just sit back and assume everything's fine. We have to learn from the mistakes of those who came before us.
You're right. Because as we've seen, fear and prejudice, they can be really powerful forces. And if we don't keep them in check, they can lead to terrible things.
This is an ancient history. It's a story that has real implications for how we handle the challenges we face today.
It's a reminder that we have to keep learning from the past, to stand up to injustice, and to create a society that's fair and just for everyone.
Speaking of learning from the past, I think it's important to talk about how the memory of Japanese internment has been preserved and how it, continues to shape our understanding of this period.
It's not something you can easily forget. The physical remains of those camps, the photographs, the stories people told, they all remind us of what happened.
And a lot of those former internment campsites, they've been turned into national historic sites, like Manzanar and Minidoka. Those places provide a tangible connection to the past, allowing visitors to, really see what life was like for those who were imprisoned there.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it, but to actually stand in those spaces, to see the barracks, the guard towers, to feel the weight of that history, it's completely different.
And then you have the museums and cultural centers dedicated to, keeping those stories alive. Places like the Japanese American National Museum in LA or the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle. They hold artifacts, documents, oral histories, artwork. They provide these amazing insights into all the different experiences of Japanese Americans during this time.
It's so important to have those spaces where those stories can be shared and, passed down to future generations. But it's not just about preserving the past, it's about connecting it to what's happening now, too.
Exactly. What we learned from the internment, it still informs how we think about civil liberties, racial justice, the dangers of the government having too much power. We see these same themes in debates about immigration, national security, how minority groups are treated.
It reminds us that the fight for equality and justice, it's never really over. We have to stay vigilant. We have to keep defending the rights of everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Japanese internment, what are the key takeaways, the things you really want our listeners to think about? It's kind of mind-blowing, how one event can have such a lasting impact, not just on laws and stuff, but on how people think, how they see the world, even generations later.
That's history for you, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about what happened way back when. It's about the stories we tell, the things we remember, and how those shape, everything.
And with Japanese internment, it feels like those echoes, they're still here. They're in so many conversations we're having right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think about all the debates we have today about immigration, about surveillance, that balance between keeping the country safe and protecting individual rights. It's all connected to what happened back then.
Yeah, like a cautionary tale playing out right in front of us,
Right.
reminding us that fear and prejudice, they can still influence decisions even today.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't just stay silent. We have to speak up when we see injustice and challenge those stories that try to blame whole groups of people.
When the Japanese American community fought for redress, it wasn't just about righting a wrong from the past. It was about setting a standard saying this can't happen again. This violation of civil liberties, it's not okay.
And that fight's still going on, not just for Japanese Americans, but for any group facing discrimination and prejudice. The lessons we learn from internment, they apply to everyone. It's about how fragile democracy can be, how important it is to have fair legal processes, and how we need to protect everyone's rights, no matter who they are or where they come from.
So for everyone listening, Even if this history doesn't feel personal to you, why should you care? Why does this matter today?
Because history repeats itself. If we don't learn from it, those same mistakes will happen again. It's a wake-up call, you know? We all have to be informed, we have to be involved, and I can't be afraid to stand up and say, this isn't right.
Japanese internment, it was a dark time in American history. But it's also a story about strength, about a community that stood up for themselves, that demanded to be heard, and in the end, they fought for justice.
And that's a story worth remembering, not just for the past, but for the future we're all creating together.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into, well, a really complicated and often overlooked part of American history. We hope this conversation, encourages you to keep learning, to keep asking questions, and to really engage with these stories that have shaped who we are.
And just remember, history isn't just something in a book. It's alive, it's constantly changing, and it's always influencing who we are, both as individuals and as a society.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.